question of education, we had best get behind the mythological America into the real America. And I would like to suggest that under the guise of the melting pot, I'm excluding the notion of integration for the moment, but that under the guise of the melting pot theory, we have in fact in this country engaged in physical genocide against such groups as the Indians, and we don't have any Indian students, I take it, here in the law school, and we have engaged in physical and cultural genocide against other minority groups, such as Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, doesn't matter, the name doesn't matter. And that this social and cultural and physical genocide has obscured the history of the country. And as a result of this obscurantism, we are not able to deal with the problems that we confront today. Now, finally, I would like to raise the question of the aim of education as it has been presented. And it seems to me, in what Arnold Kaufman has said, there is, I detect a resonance which I find reassuring. And that is to question the very notion of integration as we have been talking about it now. Because it seems to me that really what we're talking about is, if you exclude, as seems to be excluded from the discussion of integration, the notion of miscegenation of intermarriage. The fact is, if we want to really deal honestly with this problem, you know, if we use Hawaii as the model, it always is aloha, come to aloha land, you know, all those lovely people, everybody's together. No one wants to talk, least of all the Hawaiian senators, when they get into Washington, about the fact that the way this has been achieved is through a 37% rate of intermarriage. Now, I presume we could do the same thing here if we did that. I would still, however, want to raise the question of, is it worth it if the objective at the end, if what we have achieved at the end is the kind of bland, conforming society that Arnold Kaufman has referred to? And finally, I would like to say that the one thing that really troubled me, apart from the questions of education that Mr. Taylor talked, was when he used the phrase, talking about the future, when he said, apart from the political question, such and such would have to be done. And I would have to respond by saying, there is no apart from the political question. That's the basic question. And if one comes to the conclusion that in this society in which we're living at the moment, right now, that the political question is a decisive one, then I would have to come to the conclusion that the only way we'll make the solution is to get apart from the political question in another way, and that is I would invite Mr. Taylor to join the ranks of the dropouts from the Great Society, who he referred to as speaking here, because it's clear we're not going to make it inside the Great Society, we'll have to make it outside the Great Society in some political form. He's next.
Clearly. I just have two brief questions for Professor Kaufman. One, when he speaks of everyone has a right to higher education, how high is high? I assume you're stopping somewhere short of law school or hopefully a PhD. And secondly, are you against all competition, or is it simply this unfair competition of skills? Are you against, say, a competition of talents? And the third question is, I noticed this somewhat disturbing reference to sort of white middle-class tests. I think sooner or later, everyone has to be tested. Everyone can't go to medical school. I assume everyone cannot go to law school. And furthermore, sooner or later, I think we're going to have some measure to determine when what you call the technically underprivileged are no longer underprivileged. And this means some sort of measure. And I just wonder if you have any ideas what it should be. That's it.
I'll, too, be very brief. What I would have said, had I talked longer, is very much what Paul said, and in a way what Arnold said. Let me try to sharpen what seems to me to be one implication of what they've both said for Bill Taylor's presentation earlier. And one way I might put it is like this. The more that one inspects the situation today, and the more one acknowledges, as you certainly did, Bill, the fantastic injustices that have developed between the ostensibly privileged white suburban schools and the in every way underprivileged ghetto schools, it seems to me the paradox that emerges is the more one ought to be skeptical about the virtues of integrated education as a solution to the problems. What I mean is, the more one sees the situation we're in now as the effect of a society dominated by white middle-class America, the more horrifying it is to suppose that the solution to these problems is the turning of black Americans into white middle-class Americans with black skins. That seems to me the strongest argument against integration. I realize it's a very difficult thing, but I think the real problem is to what degree is the solution to shape the black kid up so he fits in comfortably and easily into the system that those of us who are on top desire to perpetuate. So.
I'm only going to take about 3 minutes, I hope, but not that I'm not tempted to say a little bit more, but my observation and going around the country, one of the most distressing things to me about the operations of government generally has been a total failure throughout systems, federal, state, and local, to involve people at all in decisions which affect their lives, to people to serve their constituency. And even here in this setting, since I assume people out here are constituency, we want at some point to involve them. So I'll take just a couple of minutes. I would agree with 95% of what Paul Jacobs has said and what Dick Wasserstrom has said. I think the question we're focusing on is solutions. And what distresses me terribly is the infinite capacity that we have, we in that other America, white society, to construct rationalizations for continuing the present system. I don't mean that perhaps exactly the way it sounds. But what's distressing to me, I'm not suggesting this is what's said here. The most distressing thing to me about, quote, black power, unquote, is the new rationalization that it's enabled white society to construct. Because here you've got 100, 200 years of rejection of the worst kinds of oppression visited on people. And now what you hear when you go around the country from people is, well, what happens is people say we've been rejected. Okay, we don't need you. We don't need you. We'll build our own society. And how does white society react? It says, see, this is the way they want it. This is the way they want it. And so we've gotten a new rationalization being constructed for continued segregation on the part of society. And I think this is a real danger. On the other side of it, it's being said, white society really isn't worth integrating with. Something which I would agree as an idealistic matter is absolutely true. But I think, Mr. Jacobs, the question you pose is how do we create this mythological society that should exist but does not exist? I think the fact of the matter is simply that society, bland and conforming as it is not going to be the same once it becomes an integrated society. I think that's the fact of the matter. We haven't got very much proof of it right now, but I think that American society, bland and conforming as it is going to change radically just by the processes that we're talking about, if we can achieve them.
Just very briefly, I'd like to answer the questions that have been put to me by Professor Hobbs. He asked first, how high does one go in cashing the right to a higher education? And I think the answer that I favor is certainly a right to a basic liberal education, as I try to specify. That is, I didn't call this examination, this education for the examined life, liberal education, but that I think is the heart and soul of a liberal education. I don't know how long that will take, 3-4 years, I suppose, that nobody should leave a college or university until he has a liberal education, or at least until we've tried to see to it that a milieu is created in which he can be natured properly. That is, I don't think a liberal education can be inculcated or taught. It has to be learned in some way, and we have to create the milieu in which it can take place. persons also have the right then to find some, to acquire training in some slot-filling function. But obviously, to the extent that the students don't select themselves in a properly distributed way, there have to be set up quite functional tests for determining who goes to law school, who goes to medical school, say if people prefer law or medicine to dentistry or philosophy. But these tests at this point in a person's career can be quite functional, and the tests that I had principally in mind were the sorts that people like Martin Gross and others have begun to criticize. That is, those tests that are given as a basis for categorizing and admitting students fairly early in the educational career, and not the very functional tests that go to slot-filling performance, competence in the performance of slot-filling tasks that I think could be devised without much difficulty once everyone was brought up to the level where he can make an intelligent selection from among various slot-filling forms of training. That is, education ends up with training, but in the first 12 or so, 16 years, 16 years, first 16 years it should be real education, primarily. I mean, you still have to acquire certain skills which are going to equip you to be a slot filler.
What's wrong with the competition of what you call talents at the end of this particular process?
Well, I think there would be a competition of talents at the end. Though I think part of the difficulty with the competition of talents at the end of this 16-year period is that in the United States, though it's mastered the problem of scarcity, has not solved the problem of distribution in an equitable way. And consequently, that competition of talents at the end of the process becomes a competition for access to scarce resources in which many who lose out really suffer a very severe economic penalty because we haven't mastered the problem of distribution. If we could somehow cope with the problem of distribution so that no one would fall too low or no one too high, and I'm not going to stop to try to say where those limits should be drawn, then it seems to me at the end of the period there ought to be a competition of talent and skills. Because along the way, people will have acquired different skills depending on the energy they put in or the direction of their attention, their particular, the particular way they carve out their life's aspirations will determine whether they want to be a particularly good doctor, devote themselves completely in the manner of Aerosmith to doctoring, or perhaps be a moderately good doctor but an artist on the side. I mean, if they make that kind of choice, then as doctors they should suffer some penalty, but they also make the choice in a way which brings some rewards.
Let me turn us now to seeking to draw the entire room into this. Let me see if there are any questions. Yes, sir.
The first one is addressed to Mr. Kaufman. In regard to your discussion of excellence and also the egalitarianism you wish to achieve in present-day American society, to me those two concepts are contradictory. You accept Rousseau as one of the individuals you believe in. I accept Tocqueville. I maintain that if American society ever became as egalitarian as you wish it to be, we have a society of the common man, the lowest common denominator. I think it's essential to have competition in American society in all fields, and especially in regard to education. At the present time, we have, in New York, what was called SP schools, and that individuals in junior high school could finish junior high school in 2 years rather than 3 years. And that was based on competitive examination before the college level. And also, it seems to me that even granted your premise that the United States has sufficient funds to outlay for education, we still have the question of the reallocation of funds and whether we just have enough prestigious universities. I'm not sure whether you wish to destroy the prestigious university and law school and medical school in American society. Competition is essential. And also just a quick question to Professor Wasserstrom. And I'm not sure quite what's wrong with the American middle class, what society's values, or what's wrong with the Puritan syndrome. I assume that you don't want American society to be the society of the ghetto, and perhaps there are disadvantages in the Puritan syndrome. But the Puritan syndrome might not be the cause of the racial hatreds in American society.
We have in the island of Cyprus, where the Turks and Greeks have fought for 400 years, and they are more or less identical. In India, we have had for a similar period strife between different sects and countries which do not accept capitalism and which don't accept the Puritan syndrome. So I think you should discuss the fact that perhaps the middle class values are the best. They have been what have made America great, and I think we are the greatest country in the world. And of course, there are disadvantages, but that's not to say that racial hatred is the cause of this Puritan syndrome.
Professor Kaufman and then Professor Wasserstrom.
Does that imply that I have less hair than Dick? Because I refuse to accept that judgment. Obviously what I have been arguing for, I thought it was obvious, but perhaps, apparently, at least there's been some confusion. I've been arguing for a system which will result in a society of common men, in which the common man has typically achieved excellence. Now, what's wrong with that? And secondly, do I want to destroy the prestigious university? Of course not. I want to make it deserve its prestige. Typically, the prestigious university today does not deserve. I don't know UCLA very well. I haven't been here long enough to judge your university, but I can judge my own, the University of Michigan. And it is a very prestigious institution, I think. Perhaps I don't want to get into invidious comparisons. It does not deserve the prestige it enjoys. It is doing an abominable job of teaching, of creating a learning situation for undergraduates, and that is the central and indispensable function of an institution like the University of Michigan. Let me give you one illustration of this. One of my students at Tuskegee, the University of Michigan and Tuskegee have an exchange relationship. And I was able, through the good offices of Dean Wasserstrom, then Dean Wasserstrom, and my good friend Tom Robichon, to go down to the to Tuskegee to teach in their freshman experimental program. I won't describe the details, but it embodied many of the features. That is, the design of a decent educational process was not as abstract as it sounded. It's something that both Tom and I have lived to some extent in teaching in this program. And one of my students, the very best student I had, who would not have been admissible in the University of Michigan, in the second year there, he did take advantage of the special relationship that exists between the University of Michigan and Tuskegee to come to the University of Michigan as an exchange student. Now, this particular student had been terribly excited by the process which he was a part and did extremely well. I won't go into the detail, I don't have the time, but he did extremely well that first year. And at the University of Michigan, he did very well. He got B's and C's by and large, and he passed everything, and he was a good student, despite the fact that when he came to Tuskegee, he could hardly write an English sentence. But you know what happened to him at the University of Michigan? What happens to most of our students, or an unhappy proportion of them? He got discouraged, jaded, and disillusioned. The University of Michigan turned out to be a bad thing for him in those circumstances because he went from a liberating experience to one that was coercive and constraining, fundamentally, though I'd like to spell that out in detail if anyone's interested.
I think in the interest of letting some other people participate, I won't try to answer your question now, Mr. Fogel. We can talk about it later. I mean, to some degree, I think, you raise an important question, that is to say, clearly, well, it's certainly not evident that whether the criticism is one of middle-class values as they're idealized, for example, versus as they predominate in our society. We'd have to sort of differentiate aspiration from practice, and there are almost two sets of values going, one the ideals we talk about and the others that seem to be operative in our behavior. But I think it would be better to let some other people in.
Yes, sir.
I'm a little concerned by the use of the term white society and by inference as being responsible for some of the problems that arise out of the absence of education in the ghetto. I think such a term is inexact. It's so amorphous that it doesn't tend to pinpoint where responsibilities are. I think there are many white people who can't do a damn thing about it one way or the other anyway. I think we got to start thinking in terms of where those areas of power and influence reside. that are responsible for the kinds of thrusts in society which have produced the kind of situation that they have. I don't think that education is a thing apart any more than the war in Vietnam is a thing apart. But they're both products of the kinds of thrusts in society that are produced by somebody in that society. And it would seem to me that we ought to begin talking in terms of the corporate structures, those centers of wealth and power, which are responsible for many of the ills in society. Then they stand back, and we tend to take the position that it's white society that does these things. And I think that it results in an inability to see precisely and exactly where the areas of responsibility lie and where the direction has to be taken in order to correct some of these things. And I have the uncomfortable feeling sometimes that people from the university are from an institution which itself is a product of these very centers of power and influence, and hence there's a reluctance to talk in terms of the groups that are sort of the hands that feed them. But nonetheless, if we're really going to make any meaningful thrust in these directions, I think that here is where we're going to have to talk.
I think you're right.
Yes.
I'd like to ask Professor Washington, you mentioned that with integration, that maybe the only result of integration would be to make white middle-class people with black skin. This is one difficulty, I think, in really trying to adjust ourselves to the problem, is that we assume, one, that integration is moving the black community into the white schools, that two, this will make the black people like white people. And I think this is wrong. I think it's very narrow vision. I would like to say, first of all, integration, if we're talking about equal opportunity for America, for kids, for people who need to know, need to understand on a gut level what it means to live in a multicolored society, that you mess up the whole school system. You take all 64 schools in LA and you make them all colored. And that the end product is not necessarily white middle-class people with black skin. And it's not necessarily soul brothers and sisters, but it's something new that we really haven't discovered yet because we have yet to have integrated schools except in a very small portion of our city.
Well, look, I certainly, to the extent to which that's what people want to talk about, it seems to me appreciably more commendable, but it seems to me that the implication of much of what's said about integration, the use of the term disadvantaged, for example, suggests that what's involved is a group of people who aren't like us, less advantaged even, not just different, but less advantaged, and that somehow our objective is to make them more like us if we possibly can. Give them the sorts of it seemed to me that this was reasonably explicit in what Mr. Taylor said, but without just forgetting about what he said. One sort of thing that people say is the way they analyze the problem is in terms of the ways in which children in the ghetto are different from the children in Beverly Hills, and the sorts of things that the children who come out of the Beverly Hills school can do, and that the answer is to have children who can do the sorts of things that the children who graduate from the Beverly Hills school can do. Now, to the extent to which that's the ideal, it seems to me a dangerous one. If there's, to the extent to which a different one is being sought and there are different ways to do it, it seems to me somewhat more optimistic.
Excuse me, I don't quite like the way you're stating the aspiration. I don't think the aspiration is to make the Negro into a white middle-class American. I think it's far more simple than that. It is simply to give him the opportunity to live like a white middle-class American if he chooses to do so. And I think that makes all the difference in the world.
I would only add that I think that by and large, the people who would articulate it in terms of making what we want to do is make Negroes more like us are the people who reject integration out of hand. Now, that doesn't say that those who accept it do not have some of the attitudes which you suggest, but I think in terms of practical experience, where it's worked out, of course it's been difficult because we're breaching walls that have existed for years and years and years. And of course there are little indignities committed every day. But where it has been done, the result has not been. Whatever people's preconceptions may have been, the result has not been that we've succeeded in making Negroes more like us. That just hasn't been the practical experience.
I'd like to
direct myself for just a second to this question of the middle class and the white middle class values. I don't see anything wrong with certain white middle class values. For example, it's a good idea to have an automobile if you live in Los Angeles. It's clearly better to have a car than have to rely on the damn buses here. Now, so it's better to have an automobile. The question, and everybody ought to have the opportunity to have an automobile. Let's skip a moment, get away for a moment from the question of the Negro or the Mexican or anybody else. Put it this way. I have a car. That's part of my being middle class. Having a car means I'm accepted by the people on my street as being like them. So far, we're all okay. Now, the real question is, the moment I take my car and I paint it flowers on it, it doesn't look like the rest of the cars on the street. You're not supposed to have a car that has flowers painted on it if you, in San Francisco, live in Pacific Heights. Now, somehow, I've made a break from the middle class. So the real problem is implicit in what he just said. That is to say, it isn't quite accurate that what we want to do is give everybody the opportunity to be middle class. We want to give them the opportunity to be middle class and to have these things, but the moment they respond by having these things in a different form than we have them, we being the general society, it's at that point that we become very troubled by that. And that's the issue that's involved. Plus, finally, the real question is not whether one ought to want to achieve these things, because I think they're worth achieving. It's better to live in a nice house than to live in a lousy ghetto house. That seems perfectly self-evident. That's not the issue. The issue is, what are you willing to do in order to live in a nice house? And at what point are you willing to give up the nice house for something else that you believe in?
We have come to and past our 12:30 time. I will therefore declare this session closed, very reluctantly, but inevitably, I fear. We will begin 15 minutes later than the program states, and that will be then at 1:45 p.m. You can obtain lunch in the Student Union. Let me now try to indicate what the theme of our program is. I think it can be better stated now that we have had Mr. Taylor and Mr. Kaufman and the reactions to it before us. Thus far, we have come through the question of what ought the concept of equal educational opportunity to mean. It's become very clear in recent years, to the great upset, certainly, of a lot of people in the business of public school administration, that the courts are molders of educational policy in the United States to a startling degree. For that reason, we turn in our next panel to the question of equal educational opportunity and the law. Given the dimensions that our earlier speakers have put before us of just what ought the concept of equality of opportunity to mean in today's America, now the question is, what will or what should the courts do in the name of the Constitution in implementing whatever theories of equality of educational opportunity are going to come to prevail? Again, I will introduce all of the people on the platform and then turn the discussion over to them. Our main speaker, seated behind me, is Frank Goodman, who is an acting professor of law at the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Goodman is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. He was a Rhodes Scholar and clerked for a judge on a United States Court of Appeals for a year. He has had some private practice, and before going into teaching, he was an assistant to the Solicitor General of the United States for a 3-year period. He's been active in the development of OEO-funded neighborhood legal services programs, and is currently doing research and writing on the very topic that is before us. We had scheduled 3 members of this panel. Mr. Thelton Henderson is not accounted for, and we will continue with the other 2 members of the panel. First, to your right, Mr. Eason Monroe, I should say Dr. Eason Monroe, who is the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Southern California. Before taking that position 15 years ago, he was a professor of language arts at San Francisco State College, and he has taught at other universities, including Penn State, University of California, and Stanford. Our other panelist is Professor William Cohen of the UCLA Law School. Professor Cohen is a UCLA graduate. He was the editor-in-chief of the UCLA Law Review in his graduating year, 1956. Following that, he was a law clerk to Mr. Justice Douglas of the United States Supreme Court. After that, on the faculty of the University of Minnesota Law School, and he came to UCLA in 1959. One of his fields is constitutional law, and he is the co-author of the Bill of Rights source book for teachers, which is now coming into extensive use throughout public education in California. First to Professor Goodman.
Thank you, Professor Horowitz. I'd like to say that you're in for a rather abrupt change of pace at this point. I feel rather like a painter of small cameos trying to follow Michelangelo's Last Judgment, coming on after Professor Wasserstrom, Professor Kaufman, and Mr. Jacobs. The issue I'm going to be talking about is a very, very narrow one. The question is whether or not the state has a federal constitutional duty to do what it feasibly can to eliminate de facto segregation in its public schools. By de facto segregation, of course, I mean that kind of racial and socioeconomic imbalance which is brought about not by any deliberate policy of segregation on the part of the school board, but rather as the incidental, unintended byproduct of the use of neighborhood residents as the criterion by which the school board assigns children to different schools within a district. Now, I think I should say at the outset that the canvas I'm painting on is even somewhat smaller than the one that Mr. Taylor used this morning. There's a lot of difference between the question of whether integration is a good idea as a matter of policy, whether it's something that we should try to do by means of legislation or by means of administrative regulation on the one hand, and whether it's the kind of thing that judges ought to be doing in the form of constitutional interpretation under the banner of interpreting the words or the policies of the federal Constitution. One can well agree, I think, though there obviously is a great deal of disagreement in this room, that integration would be a desirable thing, at least in some cities and in some circumstances. But to decide that is not necessarily to say that it is constitutionally required. On the other hand, that isn't to say that the judges have to be able to find some specific mandate in the precise language of the Constitution in order to justify ordering a school board to integrate its schools. That would be very nice. We've got that kind of a mandate in the First Amendment, which tells us that Congress, and now by implication the states, shall make no law prohibiting abridging the freedom of speech. That's pretty clear. The kind of language that is relevant to resolving our integration question is not anything like so specific. It's the provision of the 14th Amendment which says that no state shall deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. Now that is the sole basis in the Constitution for imposing a duty upon democratically elected state officials to adopt a policy contrary to the one that they wish to adopt. And if the courts are going to rely upon that kind of highly general language in order to arrive at such a result, then they must do so on the basis of principles which are generally accepted in the society, principles which can be applied neutrally, which don't dictate unacceptable consequences when applied to situations outside the context of integration, principles which don't require the court to make all kinds of factual determinations which, as a court, it is not competent to make, and principles which do not require all kinds of ad hoc judgments in specific situations in order to be applied. In other words, the kind of principle that sort of applies itself so that the court doesn't constantly have to come in and meddle every other month with some determination of the school board. Now, I think maybe some of these basic conditions for the intervention by courts in the what most people and I think most judges still regard as pretty much a question of legislative policy will become clearer as I go along. Now, let me say first what the state of the law is at present on this issue. As you know, in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the Supreme Court held that de jure segregation, that is to say, segregation which is expressly commanded by law, or indeed, even if it isn't expressly commanded by law, if it's brought about purposefully by some state policy, even through gerrymandering or through the selection of school sites in areas where segregation would be the inevitable consequence, that kind of deliberate segregation is unconstitutional. The reason it's unconstitutional, though, is not simply because it's harmful to Negro children, something which may also be true of de facto segregation, as Mr. Taylor outlined to us this morning, but rather, and I think this is quite clear from the decision, because what the state had done was to classify individuals on the basis of their race, something that the court said was virtually unconstitutional per se, completely obnoxious to our whole democratic tradition. It was a classification which lacked any possible relevance to any legitimate state purpose, and on that ground was bad. Now, of course, that doesn't apply to de facto segregation, and for that and other reasons which are too cumbersome for me to get into in the time available to me, I don't think that Brown versus Board of Education has really any application whatever to the issue before us here. Most of the courts have agreed with that view. All of the federal courts of appeals which have dealt with this issue have held that there is no constitutional duty on the part of school boards to alleviate racial imbalance so long as they have not deliberately created that racial imbalance. There are one or two federal trial courts which have taken the opposite view. The Supreme Court of California has held that there is a constitutional duty to take steps that are reasonably feasible to alleviate racial imbalance, but that's about the sum total of the decisions favorable to the constitutional principle that I'm going to be discussing. Now, let me say at the outset what my own view of the matter is. I believe, contrary to most of the courts, that there is a duty on the part of school boards to do what they can to reduce racial imbalance in the schools, to eliminate it if possible. But I also think that this duty is a narrow one, that it applies only when the circumstances are right, and that increasingly they are not right in most of our major cities and even in some of our smaller communities. Now, let me distinguish at the outset between a prima facie constitutional duty, that is to say, a duty to desegregate the schools if you can, or if there aren't very good reasons on the other side of the scale not to, and the ultimate question of whether you have to adopt, after taking into account all considerations on both sides of the scale, a particular means of desegregation. I think a very strong argument can be made that there is a prima facie constitutional duty on the part of school boards to desegregate. Whether or not they actually have to do so in any particular situation depends upon how strong the state interest is in that particular, in the circumstances of that situation, and whether or not those competing circumstances outweigh the interest in integration itself. Now, what seems to me the most persuasive argument in favor of a duty to desegregate is this: that the inevitable consequence of grouping children on the basis of neighborhood residence for purposes of assigning them to different public schools within a particular district is to accord a grossly inferior education, not just to Negroes, not just to poor people, but to all of the people who reside in slum neighborhoods. Now, the point here, see, this principle is not simply part of the law of racial discrimination. It's not part of the law of discrimination against the poor. We have a lot of cases decided in recent years by the Supreme Court dealing with the duty, dealing with various kinds of indirect discrimination against the poor. I don't think this principle is of that type either. This is a much simpler, more straightforward, more conventional constitutional argument. It simply says this: the state has classified people on the basis of neighborhood. It has told people in the south side of town they've got to go to South High, and all the people on the north side of town that they've got to go to North High. And the consequence of doing this is that everybody in South Side gets a lousier education than the people in North Side. So really, it has classified the people on the south side of the community disadvantageously, educationally, on the basis of where they live, a criterion which really is, ought to be irrelevant to the quality of the education they receive. Now, the factual premises that I'm adopting in reaching that conclusion are very much those that Mr. Taylor outlined to you this morning. It seems to me there are now a very impressive body of data which show that the level of academic proficiency which a child reaches in the schools is a function not only of his own ability, not only of his own family background, but also, and not only of the quality of the school, I might add, the teachers, the curriculum, the facilities, but is also very powerfully influenced by the background and aspirations and other socioeconomic characteristics of the children who surround him in the classroom. Now, in part, this is due to the fact that children learn from each other, the point that Mr. Taylor made to us this morning, what some sociologists call the influence of the peer group culture, the way in which a child emulates those around him. Their values rub off on him. Pace, Mr. Wasserstrom. That's part of it. I don't think that's all of it, and I think that perhaps an even more important reason why children in predominantly middle-class schools, when I say children, I mean children regardless of their own social class, a lower-class Negro, a lower-class white, or a middle-class white, why any of these will do better in a predominantly middle-class school than in a predominantly lower-class school is the fact that teachers in predominantly middle-class schools entertain a much higher level of expectation for the children in that class than teachers in the lower-class school. They move at a faster rate. They cut out a larger task for themselves. They assign more material. They expect more from the children. In the lower-class school, there's a good deal of empirical evidence that teachers regard their function as primarily a custodial one. There's one finding I recall particularly, for example, that in one school system, it was found that 80% of the teacher's time in the lower-class ghetto schools was consumed in simply keeping order, whereas between 40 and 50% of the teacher's time in the middle-class school was spent in that, which struck me as rather high. But that alone, if you just think of the number of additional hours available for genuine instructional work that allows the middle class, the children in the middle class school, it seems to me right there it becomes perfectly natural that all of the children in that classroom, whatever their own social class, should be able to learn more. And also another factor that can't be ignored, I think, is the way in which the teacher's expectation of the class then influences the child's attitude toward himself. It's very probable, it seems to me, that in a predominantly lower-class classroom where the teacher has low expectations of everybody, that these sets of expectations rub off on the school child just as do the values and attitudes of his own peers, and that this tends to depress his achievement level. Well, assuming that all this is true, and let me say that I'm much less sanguine than Mr. Taylor is about whether it really is true. I think that much of the evidence that Mr. Taylor cited to us this morning is open to very, very serious methodological question. Let me cite, if I may, only one of my qualifications that I would make to Mr. Taylor's evidence. The one thing we really don't know, despite all of the evidence that has been gathered by first the Coleman study and then the analysis done on it by Mr. Taylor's commission, is exactly the extent to which the higher achievement of Negro children in predominantly white schools is due to the fact that these were brighter Negro children to begin with than the children who attend segregated schools. There's a lot of evidence that the primary motivation of Negro parents in moving into predominantly white neighborhoods is the quest for better schools, for better education. It seems to me only natural that once the parents move into that neighborhood for that reason, they're also going to be much more supportive of the child in his school efforts. So that it would be very surprising if the Negro children in predominantly white schools didn't perform better, even than children of the same social class in the segregated schools. The children who go to schools which have up to now been integrated, voluntarily integrated, are also children who have chosen to take advantage of open enrollment plans or who have been selected for that purpose by teachers on the basis of their demonstrated potential. And it would seem to me to be entirely possible that the higher achievement shown by Negro children in predominantly white schools is due to those factors alone, rather than to the racial composition or socioeconomic composition of the school. Now, I've tried to leave the issue of race out of my discussion up to now. Essentially, my argument has been that children will learn more in predominantly middle-class schools, regardless of its racial composition, than they do in predominantly lower-class schools, and that will be true of a white child or a Negro child. And the constitutional argument that I'm making is one which would be equally available to a white child in an all-white community. It seems to me that he could demand that socioeconomic imbalance in the schools be eliminated on exactly the same grounds that a Negro could demand that the racial or socioeconomic imbalance of the schools be eliminated. In essence, the facts that I've outlined for you suggest that children are not only consumers of education, they're also important producers of education vis-a-vis their fellow classmates. They're very important educational resources in their own right. They're items of educational input, if you like, just as much as the teacher is, just as much as the curriculum and the facilities are. Now, if you will allow me to assume for a moment, and I think this assumption is open to a great many questions that we're not going to have time to go into here, but if you will allow me to assume that the Equal Protection Clause at least requires school boards to give all children equal access to the educational resources of the community, to invest in each child's education a roughly comparable amount of resources. This was, I believe, Professor Kaufman's minimal notion of equality of educational opportunity that he outlined this morning. It seems to me not a particularly difficult proposition to accept that the Constitution requires at least this much of the school boards, so that it would be constitutionally impermissible, for example, for a school board to, instead of providing publicly operated schools, to simply make grants of $500 to the children in North Side and $200 to the children in South Side, if you will assume with me that that is unconstitutional. And assume with me further that it is just as unconstitutional to expend $500 per pupil on the children in the North Side School District and only $200 per pupil on the children in the South Side School District, then I suggest that it is equally incumbent upon the state to make a fair and even distribution of those resources which are represented by a child's fellow students. If you assume that the high-achieving, high-aspiring, advantaged background middle-class child is an educational resource, as it were an assistant teacher, then why shouldn't the same argument that requires even distribution of dollar inputs also require an even distribution of these equally valuable educational inputs among all of the schools within a community so that each child in the system has equal access to them? And it seems to me this argument gains strength from the fact that the Coleman data tell us that the characteristics of a child, of the student body of the school that a child attends, has a much greater influence upon his educational development than any of the more conventional types of educational inputs, teachers, dollars, etc. So if you're going to require equal distribution of those, you should certainly also require equal distribution of the educationally valuable fellow students. Now, this immediately raises one question for which I don't have an answer, but it goes back to some of the points that Mr. Taylor was raising this morning. If it's true that the school board simply has a duty to distribute all resources, including fellow student resources, evenly throughout the district, would it be permissible for a school district to say, we choose to have compensatory education in our ghetto schools instead of integrating those schools? Instead of having an even distribution of the educationally valuable middle-class students, what we choose to do is leave them unevenly distributed, as they now are, but give the Negro schools extra dollar inputs, smaller classes, special services and counseling programs, and other compensatory devices of that kind. And we assume that these countervailing benefits will cancel themselves out. After all, a court is not in a position to choose between a library and a laboratory, is it? It's not in a position to decide whether an extra guidance teacher in this school is more or less than offset by an extra remedial reading teacher in that school. Equal educational opportunity, no matter how you slice it, doesn't make the court competent to make qualitative judgments like that. So why should it be competent to make the judgment that the compensatory education program we have in the ghetto school isn't every bit as valuable as integration would be, or as the even distribution of middle-class students throughout the community would be? Now, I leave that question without really having an adequate answer to it. It seems to me that compensatory education of that type would excuse the school board from adopting an integrational program, that even if it were otherwise required to do so. Now, let me add a couple of other arguments which seem to me to be independently valid. So far, as I say, I've excluded the question of race from consideration, but it does seem to me that there are some additional arguments available to a Negro child that would not be available to a white child. Let me first of all mention an argument that I don't think is available to him. It is not open to him to argue, or at least it would not be persuasive to me to argue that the neighborhood school plan and its concomitant socioeconomic and racial segregation hurts more Negroes than whites, that there are many more Negro children in the ghetto schools than there are white children in slum schools, and therefore it is, in a de facto sense, a racially discriminatory policy. Now, that seems to me an impermissible kind of an argument. On that theory, all kinds of things would be unconstitutional. Government job qualifications, for example, requiring a high school diploma, might tend to disqualify more Negroes than whites. But it would not disqualify, but it would have exactly the same effect on the Negro and the white person similarly situated, with similar qualifications. The sales tax, automobile license taxes, the poll tax, all kinds of things hurt Negroes more than whites, in the sense that they hurt poor people, and more Negroes are poor. But no court has ever suggested that any of those things was unconstitutional because of their effect upon because of their differential effect upon Negroes. The Negro has to show that he's hurt as a Negro, not simply that the program hurts him and hurts a lot of Negroes. Now, given that, there still are two arguments open to him. The first, it seems to me, is this. Now, I only have time to sketch this in very briefly. First argument is this, that the reason why the Negro child lives in the ghetto and therefore comes within the class which is disadvantaged by the neighborhood school plan. Remember, the class disadvantaged is all children who live in ghetto neighborhoods, slum neighborhoods, lower class neighborhoods. The reason that the Negro lives there and therefore comes within the disadvantaged class is very often simply and solely because white homeowners, real estate operators, lending institutions, etc., refuse to deal with him. In other words, it is solely and directly because of racial discrimination. So that one can say, with respect to those Negroes, that the racially exclusionary policy of the white homeowner, combined with the geographically exclusionary policy of the school board, to deprive the Negro of educational opportunities which would have been available to him but for the color of his skin. Now, there are many examples in the law, I haven't got time to go into it, but there are many examples in which a non-discriminatory policy of the state combines with a discriminatory policy of a private individual to produce an unconstitutional result which wouldn't have been unconstitutional simply by virtue of the state's action alone or the private individual's action alone. But when they combine, they produce an unconstitutional result. It seems to me that this argument, however, is one which is only available to those Negroes, and they're only going to be the middle-class Negroes, who can show that they were, in fact, discriminated against in the attempt to purchase a home in the neighborhood of the school that they seek admission to. The other argument is that even though the neighborhood school policy is damaging to the educational development of all children in ghetto areas, it is more damaging to the Negro child than to the white child similarly situated. It hurts a lower-class Negro child more than it hurts a lower-class white child. So that, in effect, you can say again that the policy in its effect, if not in its purpose, is racially discriminatory. It is disadvantageous to the Negro child because he is a Negro. Now here the essential factual premise is that racial segregation, the racial composition of the class, the fact that the child goes to a predominantly Negro class has an adverse effect upon his learning ability above and beyond the effect that just going to a predominantly lower class would have on him. And on that question, notwithstanding what Mr. Taylor said this morning, I think the evidence is very, very questionable. It's not at all clear that the racial composition of a school has any independently harmful effect upon the Negro child. If it does, I suppose the reasons are those that the Supreme Court laid out in the Brown case, that simply being in a school surrounded by other Negroes produces a sense of stigmatization in the Negro, feeling that he's been put there as an expression of society's disapproval of him, with resultant generation of feelings of inferiority and other psychologically disabling loss of self-esteem. That may be true, we don't know for sure. If it is true, then I think that the argument is available to him that since he is being affected in a racially specific way, the policy can be challenged as being racially discriminatory. Now, there would be some other subsidiary arguments that I would want to make in behalf of either the Negro or the white plaintiff in order to establish a prima facie case. But I think that one has to turn now to the what's on the other side of the scale. There are an awful lot of problems in the way of implementing this, in the way of achieving desegregation in most communities, which I think would probably relieve the state of any obligation to actually adopt full-scale integration. Let me say first that the neighborhood school plan itself is certainly a rational policy. And there are many constitutional lawyers, I would venture to say most, who would say that if you accept that premise, that's all there is to the ballgame. That's all the state has to do, is show that its policy is rational, that it does not discriminate on the basis of race or infringe any of the rights protected by the specific provisions of the Bill of Rights, and the state's policy must be approved by the court. I don't share that view. I think for reasons I haven't got time to go into, having to do with the importance of education, the historic commitment of our educational system to equality, the fact that for various reasons the political processes cannot be relied upon to achieve educational equality, that the courts must be willing to take a somewhat closer look at educational policies of the state than merely to determine whether they're rational or not. The state's got to show something more than rationality. And it does seem to me that one can show that the neighborhood school plan, the neighborhood school policy, though rational, is not much more than rational. The purposes of the plan, as everybody knows, is to get children to and from school quickly, safely, economically, and conveniently. Secondly, it's to provide some continuity between the child's home environment and his school environment, to enable him to associate with the same children in school and out of school, to make it easier for him to participate in after-school extracurricular activities, to enable the parent to participate more in school affairs, and possibly to knit together the community by providing a central institution which can be a focal point for community activities. Most of those objectives, almost all of them, could be fully achieved completely without resort to the neighborhood school policy as we now know it, by which I mean a policy which tells a child you must go to the school in your neighborhood. You may not go to the school across the tracks, even if there's room for you there. If I can just briefly document my statement that these advantages can be gained even without the neighborhood school plan. It seems to me, for example, that if what you want is children to be able to play together with their neighborhood chums, with their school chums after school, well, you can get that perfectly well through a Princeton plan, sort of a pairing arrangement by which two adjacent schools having complementary racial compositions are combined, so that all children in both schools in a given grade will attend one of the schools, and all children in the next grade will attend the other school. That preserves the continuity of association with neighborhood friends, because all the children in a particular neighborhood go to the same school. It's just that they're also there with children from the other neighborhood. The objective of parent participation in school affairs, nobody's ever produced any evidence that white parents would participate any less in the affairs of the school if the school became integrated, or if their children had to be bused to another school, than they do in the affairs of their neighborhood school. And I rather suspect they'd participate a lot more. They'd be a lot more concerned with what was going on in the school. They would be a lot less in a position to rely upon some of their surrogates, their equivalents, to carry the ball for them. Nor has there ever been any evidence that Negro parents would participate any less if they had to go a distance to get to the school, because the reason they don't participate now has nothing to do. They're not participating now even when they live on top of the school. The reason they don't is complicated. It has to do with the hostility of the school environment, the alien feeling they get in attempting to associate with middle-class white teachers and so forth. But an important point here, I think, is the fact that quite apart from whether a child's own parent participates in the activities of the school, a child may derive benefits simply from going to a school in which there is a large amount of parent participation. And the Negro child would get the benefit of that if under a system of integration, whereas now he doesn't get the benefit of any large amount of parent participation, his own or his classmates' parents. One thing I think everyone would agree, and that is that the objectives of the neighborhood school plan certainly do not justify telling a child that he cannot transfer from the ghetto school to a predominantly middle-class school which has available unused capacity. His being permitted to do that does not deprive any other child, obviously, of the right to attend the school in his neighborhood. And for that reason, I would suggest that certainly an open enrollment plan is constitutionally mandatory, because the interests which favor integrated education for those who apply for transfer are not counterbalanced by anything at all on the other side of the scale. Now, as far as other policies are concerned, as far as other methods of integration, I think the scope for those other remedies is very, very limited in our large cities now. And I say that for this reason. Ideal integration, of course, complete and total integration, would be achieved when, through busing arrangements or otherwise, the racial or socioeconomic composition of each school reflected that of the community at large. But we have a good deal of evidence from the Coleman Report, from the Civil Rights Commission Report, and from other sources to the effect that the claimed benefits of integration really are available only when the resulting school has a predominance of middle-class children in it. In other words, it doesn't do a lower-class child any good to be transferred from a school in which has 10% middle-class children or 0% to one which has 20, 30, 40, or even 50%. It has to be predominantly middle-class. And if this data is to be believed, it seems to me not altogether surprising, because if teacher expectations are generally geared to the overall average of the class, then you have to have a class in which the overall average is essentially middle class before she's going to have middle class types of expectations for the kids. And if it's the peer group climate, the predominant ethos of the school which determines a child's own educational aspirations within that school and his motivations and values, then it seems to me the prevailing values of the school have to be favorable to educational endeavor. It's not enough that there just be a handful of students there to gawk at, if that's the way in which children are supposed to learn from each other. Well, if all of this is true, then in a great many of our northern cities, it is already impossible to achieve a favorable racial balance in all schools. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Newark, Oakland, in all of these cities, you already have a preponderance of Negro children in the schools and probably a larger preponderance of lower class children in the schools, including white children. Therefore, it becomes impossible for the court to order to achieve any of the benefits of integration in those schools by ordering a perfect racial composition to be achieved. Now, even if you could get over these difficulties, as you can in many smaller communities today, or even if this evidence is impeached, as I think possibly it can on various theories, you run into a further difficulty. The evidence we have, and the Civil Rights Commission states this categorically in its recent report, is that what counts for the child's educational development is not the racial or socioeconomic composition of his school, but the racial or socioeconomic composition of his classroom. What that means is that, and further, that actually a child's achievement will be higher if a child is going to be attending a predominantly lower class classroom, he will be better off in a predominantly lower class school than in a predominantly middle class school. So in other words, any school system which retains the tracking system and which, as one would expect, assigns most of the lower class and Negro children to the lower tracks because of their lack of preparation, will not be accomplishing anything at all by busing arrangements designed to homogenize the composition of the schools. Now, it has been argued, and Judge Skelly Wright has recently held in a district court opinion in the District of Columbia, that the tracking system itself is unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional for the reasons that Professor Kaufman indicated this morning, that children are selected at a very young age on the basis of an IQ test, which is heavily biased in favor of middle-class children, and on the basis of such a test is assigned to a track in which it is assumed that his capacity prevents him from ever achieving at the level of the higher track students. In other words, he's not simply tracked into a separate ability grouped classroom where efforts will be made to bring him back into the so-called mainstream of the school. He is separated, he is shunted off into a sort of academic trash heap where he will be given various kinds of vocational training and sort of watered-down curriculum designed to get him through school in one form or another. So the really Skelly Wright held, what the school has done is it has classified individuals in such a way as permanently to handicap for the rest of their lives those children who are assigned to the lower tracks, and it has done so really on the basis of socioeconomic class, not on the basis of ability at all. But I think very few judges would have been willing to go as far as Skelly Wright. Certainly they would, and even he wouldn't have been willing to adopt the decision that he did in the case of a tracking system which genuinely and honestly was intended to catch the lower track students up. And if you have a good faith tracking system, it seems to me clear that that would be approved by the courts, and that therefore to integrate a child into a school in which he is going to be segregated in the classroom would achieve no advantage and therefore could not be constitutionally mandatory. Well, I've used up my time again. The upshot of this discussion is that I think that the most that any school board, that any court will require of any school board is A, that it adopt a program of open enrollment, B, that it supplements such a program by providing free transportation to those schools, to those students who transfer, and C, that in appropriate areas it redraw boundary lines where that can be done, without completely undermining the purposes of the neighborhood school plan, and further that it adopt school pairing arrangements where that can be feasibly accomplished, where you have schools with appropriate compositions in close geographical propinquity to one another. Beyond that, I don't believe that a court would be prepared to go, but if it would be, I would suggest, on the basis of the theories which I've outlined. Thank you.
Have you gentlemen worked out a system to identify who goes
Same amount
first?
of hair.
Yes, that's what was worrying me over here. But how would alphabetical order be?
That's fine.
I was worried how you were going to do that. I think I come out about the same place that Professor Goodman does. I believe that one of the major social problems in this country is the organization of our current school system around groupings of similar socioeconomic class, so that the children in each neighborhood school look as much alike as peas in a pod. I think it's a major social problem in this country that we have to get about solving as quickly as possible. I also believe that the Constitution imposes some constitutional obligation upon governmental bodies to do something about it. I think I get there in a little bit different way. I'm not sure that I require as much hard data about the impact of the present system on the actual educational achievement of children. I think I'd put a little more emphasis upon the psychological harm to Negro children without reference to the harm to their learning ability, but I'm not sure this is the place to talk about what amounts to a constitutional quibble in terms of what you put onto a constitutional scale. I'd like to make 2 points that really emphasize a larger scope of agreement with Professor Goodman's thesis. The first point is that it is not at all clear, despite what I think is a constitutional scholar, it is not at all clear that the United States Supreme Court recognizes any kind of affirmative obligation to do something about de facto segregation. There are constitutional law scholars whose intelligence, if not judgment, I trust, who disagree with both of us as to the question whether any such obligation exists. So people who are very strongly committed to integration as a goal should not be misled into thinking that there's clear constitutional authority in this country for the proposition that de facto segregation must be terminated immediately. A second point, and this is the point of agreement, and this is a very important point to keep in mind. Even were such a constitutional proposition firmly established in this country, it might not help much. There are real limits to what can be done at the point of a judicial decree. Brown versus Board of Education was important. I think it was vitally important to this country in many ways. But one hard fact that many people have overlooked is that more actual integration in the Deep South was accomplished in 1 year under guidelines set by the United States Office of Education than had been accomplished in 12 years by a series of judicial decrees. And even with all of that, the amount of integration that actually exists in Southern schools is still quite small. We have, in the state of California, lived for almost 5 years now with a judicial decision which says there is a constitutional obligation, or at least some kind of obligation, to do something about de facto segregation. At the time the decision came down in the summer of 1963, I think quite naively hoped that once the principle had been established, it would serve some kind of educational function with school boards, and then we could proceed rapidly with clearing up the details to doing something about the major problem in the state. Well, the hard fact has been that the decision in Jackson versus the Pasadena School District has had, as far as I can tell, exactly no impact upon the status of de facto segregation in the state. In the city of Pasadena, which you would think has some connection with that case, I asked members of the Pasadena School Board whether they thought the board had some obligation to do something about Pasadena's problem of racial imbalance in the schools. I was told that the board thought there was no such obligation. And I asked, well, what about the Jackson case? After all, that involved Pasadena. And I was told, well, that case never went to trial, which is true. The NAACP and the ACLU were happy with winning a principle and never, in fact, brought the case to trial. There have not, as a matter of fact, since the Jackson case, been any further cases that have reached an appellate level in California that tell us what the obligation to cure de facto segregation means. Were a large number of cases brought to trial, there's a good chance that any such obligation may be a very conservative obligation indeed. It may, for all we know, go no further than open enrollment systems, which are a device to help some Negroes and are important as such, but do very little for the hardcore ghetto schools other than drain them of some of their upwardly mobile and more talented students. It is another hard fact in this country, I think, that a large a large share, or at least in terms of the cities with the worst problems, if the matter were put to a vote now, it's very doubtful that there is any consensus of public opinion that de facto segregation represents an important problem, or that any really radical or expensive solutions ought to be used to cure the problem. Now, when you run into that kind of political situation, there's always a great temptation to turn to the Constitution as a way out. Well, it is so clear to me that this is such a serious problem, and if the political leaders won't recognize it, at least I'll get the courts to recognize it in the Constitution and make political leaders do the right thing. That's very tempting. But I think it obscures the real fact that it's very doubtful that judicial decrees are going to do much to solve the problem in this country. The real problem, it seems to me, is to somehow, and I don't know how this is to be done, convince the vast majority of comfortable suburban people sending their children to what they consider to be high achievement suburban schools that there is a real problem which ought to be solved, and it can be solved without committing educational harm upon their own children. That's the great job that has to be done. If that is not done, it seems to me that a constitutional principle that school boards have to do something about de facto segregation will, in the long run, come to mean not much at all.
Mr. Monroe? I'm a little uncertain of my credentials to participate in this conference. I cannot consider myself a philosopher. My educational experience, as you heard earlier, is way, way back there behind me, and I'm not a lawyer. I am instead a practitioner of the pursuit of principle, as Bill Cohen has suggested, in a hard, daily, practical way. So comments that I make relate to that. That is, what is to be done and what can be done about what clearly is one of the more difficult problems facing the American people today, interwoven, as the panel this morning suggested, with all the other sicknesses of this particular society. It's a kind of tragic manifestation of that sickness that we come to a point where we must depend upon the courts to tell us what is right. Not that courts don't have that function, but they ought not exclusively to bear that function and responsibility in relation to such a problem as this. Why haven't the legislatures dealt with this problem effectively? Why, I like to ask, haven't the educators? And here I'm reminded of all the kinds of sophistries that kick around in the discussion of this problem. The neighborhood school has become suddenly a very sacred institution, and we just can't conceive of school or education without it until the neighborhood school that our children happen to attend, if we are whites, becomes predominantly Negro. And then the neighborhood school becomes unimportant totally, and we load our children on buses and ship them 50 miles across town to a private school. So the neighborhood school really, which I think bears very little functional importance in educational work really, is a kind of excuse for us to hold on to things as they were. Then there's this kind of circular logic which starts by saying the reason that schools are segregated is that all the Negroes live in one part of town. If they will move, distribute themselves, but they can't do that, of course, until they get jobs. But then they can't get jobs because they're badly educated and trained, and so there they are stuck in that circle permanently. Then there's the sophistry that compensatory education is the answer to the problem. That if we can make our schools equal, though still separate, somehow Negro children will get the kind of education they need, Mexican children the kind they need, and so forth, and then somewhere way, way up ahead we can put them all together. But again, that's purely a delaying tactic, and compensatory education, although it is important, I would say, in the term that Professor Kaufman was talking about this morning, that we ought to provide somehow the best kind of education for every youngster in this society, the kind that he needs, and we certainly can afford to do that. To use the device of compensatory education as a delay is futile. I heard the best answer to that argument by a rough-hewn Negro participant in the White House Conference on Civil Rights a couple of years ago, when the whole problem of the quality of education being afforded Negroes in the South and North was under discussion. Some of the participants there were calling for, we don't care about integration, we want better education for our children. And his comment cryptically to that was, when Mr. Charlie's son sits down across the aisle from my son, they'll both have a chance of getting better education, and not until then. And it seems to me, again, in rather simplistic and practical fashion, that we must find ways of integrating all the children in our schools. I want this not so much for the benefit of Negro children, and that's been emphasized here. What hasn't been emphasized is that I think this is important for white children. I think no child can be well educated in this society at this point of world history and American history unless he has an opportunity in his classroom to be educated with children of other races, colors, creeds, beliefs, and so forth. And I would include in that a mixture of the economic scale, too. That, in that kind of situation, where total integration is effected and occurs, then we can begin to have education. Now, how this is going to be solved, I don't know. It's one of the more stubborn problems. A local example in my own experience, for 5 years, I and others in this community tried to convince the Los Angeles Board of Education only to adopt a policy, no change of program at all, only to say that they favored integration. It took 5 years, and finally they've said it. But with Brown versus Board of Education, Jaxis versus Pasadena, all the judicial doctrine, all the social doctrine, all the American ideals and beliefs that we have, this board would not even say it publicly. Now they've said it. I don't expect any program change to occur. Some may, but it'll be very slow. Admittedly, it's costly and difficult to effect in a large metropolitan area like Los Angeles, as it certainly must be in Chicago, in New York. It can be done more practically in Berkeley. It has been done quite practically in Riverside. In smaller communities, it's a lot easier. But this is not an excuse for school boards to refuse to say they attach themselves to this idea or to develop programs toward it. And here, I think, is the function practically that the courts must fulfill. And the American Civil Liberties Union, which is my practical place of work, has gone to the court repeatedly to ask this question. And now we ask it in California, and we are asking it of a Superior Court judge in Los Angeles County. Does the Los Angeles Board of Education have an affirmative duty to desegregate the schools of Los Angeles? I think I must be more optimistic than Professor Goodman or Professor Cohen suggest. I think we're going to get a positive answer to that question. I think we may get it here in Los Angeles. If we don't get it here, the impact of this social issue on the courts, the, if not tightly construed relationship or the fully defensible legalistic relationship between a grant of the equal protection of the law to this particular problem, if it isn't intimate and close, at least there is a developing sense of obligation on the part of lawyers, courts, and I think from that ultimately to the social agencies and the educational agencies to implement this doctrine. The courts can be and are being, in a sense, our last resort to reason and good sense, if not sound constitutional principle.
With the absence of Mr. Henderson, I think I will take advantage of my position at this point to turn myself into a panelist for a couple of moments to try to add some other questions that occur to me with respect to the role of the courts here. And I suppose I should make clear perhaps where my proclivities lie as compared to what Professor Goodman has suggested and Professor Cohen. Maybe I'm a little bit less defensive about the notion of courts being makers of on-the-line, everyday social policy, recognizing that that may not be ideally their role, but perhaps it's simply coming to be their role, and we have to recognize that and make use of the courts for that purpose. But aside from that very general question, I would propose two issues that I think that are very relevant here, and I think to start us off, I will choose to direct my two questions to Professor Goodman. You talked, Frank, about equality in the distribution of resources, or I like the way you talked about it, equality in the inputs that go into the total educational product. Why should there not be a constitutional obligation in the next 10 years, then, for public agencies to spend $160 billion so as to equalize the inputs? In other words, if it can be demonstrated that there are inputs that are not going into public education, then why is this not a very conservative constitutional position to take, which simply is, if we're going to have public education and you have to equalize inputs, and if it costs $160 billion, that's too bad. We'll just have a really spectacular form of Skelly Wright opinion and Hobson and Hanson that will meet the problem at the level at which it must be met. The other question I would want to put before us is this. You have referred to the neighborhood school and all of the arguments that are made for the neighborhood school, the purposes it serves, whether that's an adequate constitutional justification for the inequalities in educational opportunity, which the Coleman Report and the Civil Rights Commission report suggest exist. The question I ask is this. Is not the notion of the individual school district just as suspect today as the attendance zone? What is so ironclad about having to talk about areas here, a Beverly Hills school district and a Los Angeles school district? Are not your arguments exactly applicable to cross-district lines? Why not constitutionally required enrollment across school district lines? Beverly Hills has empty places, then why can't kids who want to go there, why can't they go to the Beverly Hills school? And let me make clear, I'm using Beverly Hills as a not very good example because it's so small compared to the giant around it that it's really not, it's only for illustrative purposes. That's not a practical solution, but it illustrates the point. Or why not a Princeton plan among school districts? If you're going to combine 2 elementary schools because of the makeup of their populations and have all the kids go to 1 through 3 grades and all the rest through the other 3 grades, say, of elementary school, then why not say you've got to combine school districts if that's going to be a way to end up with integrated school populations? So, to repeat, 1, why isn't there a constitutional obligation to spend what's necessary? And 2, why aren't school districts just like attendance zones within individual school districts?
I think that the 2 questions you've asked are really very, very closely related to each other. If we are still adopting the assumption that the Equal Protection Clause requires equalization of inputs within a single school district rather than across school district lines throughout a whole metropolitan area, then I would question your premise that the existing disparities in input as between schools in the same district even approach that dimension. If you're talking about inputs in the conventional sense of dollar inputs or variations in teacher experience or variations in the quality of the facilities and things like that, there's a lot of evidence that these differences are really not very great. Now, I know we can all think of examples, individual examples of where they are great, and there have been 1 or 2 studies of particular cities which suggested rather dramatic differences in the per pupil expenditures as between the ghetto schools and the outlying middle-class schools within the city school system. But the Coleman Report indicates that this is really not a representative picture, that by and large the schools that Negroes attend, and I talk about Negroes simply because the Coleman data is broken down by race and not by social class, are really very little different in their input characteristics from the schools that white children attend. Now, there are obviously some very dramatic differences between the inputs of a center city school system, between the resources expended upon the children in that system and the resources expended in the surrounding suburban areas. So that really your demand that the government, state or federal, expend billions of dollars to equalize inputs becomes applicable only if you assume a duty to create equality within whole metropolitan areas. Now, as far as the merits of that suggestion are concerned, I agree with you that it has a great deal of appeal. It is really the only hope of achieving any meaningful integration. I think that's quite clear because we have a diminishing supply of white middle-class students in the center city systems. It's only by achieving some form of integration throughout metropolitan areas that you can hope to really accomplish anything. So that a judicial decree requiring cross-district integration would be a lot more promising than more conventional kind of decrees I've been talking about. Now, Judge Skelly Wright and a few other people have advocated such a position. They have said, as you've implied, Professor Horowitz, that there really ought not to be any difference between the various attendance areas within a district and the various districts within a metropolitan area, that the state is really in charge of all education for a state. It fixes the uniform curricula for the entire state. It establishes teacher training credentials, imposes other kinds of requirements. It is usually assigned by the state constitution the responsibility for all education within the state, and the state ought not to be able to absolve itself of constitutional duties simply by establishing systems of separate districts or separate school districts within metropolitan areas. But the fact is, as you know, that so far the court has never applied the Equal Protection Clause across political entities. It has refused to do so repeatedly. And So simply as a matter of precedent, I would be a little pessimistic as to the chances of such a position. And on the merits, I would simply say this, that the one difference, it seems to me, between that issue and the issue that arises within a single district is that you have another important weight that you've got to put on the state's side of the scale. In addition to the neighborhood school plan, however unfunctional it may be educationally, you've got to also put the advantages of local control of the schools, which, as many of you, as all of you know, is a value which is given a great deal of lip service in our society. Whether or not it's a shibboleth, I leave to you. But it would seem to me very difficult, for example, to order the busing of Beverly Hills students into the Los Angeles school system without simply abolishing the separate school board system of control altogether. I mean, how are you going to tell Beverly Hills parents that they have to send their children to Los Angeles schools if you don't give them a voice in selecting school boards and all the rest of it? So you really have to obliterate those lines and extinguish the local control of the Beverly Hills parents of their schools. And let me say that local control at a very intimate level is something that not only white middle-class parents demand, it's being demanded increasingly by Negroes. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the controversy in New York over the Harlem PS 201, in which the parents have demanded exactly that. They say, we don't want integration. We don't want to have our children sent out to other schools or have other kids sent into ours. What we want is to have our own school board with complete control over our own school, our own curriculum, so we can teach the kind of subjects that we think our children need. We want this a lot more than integration. And the Ford Foundation, Mr. Bundy, who's the head of the Ford Foundation, has recently reported to the New York City School School Administration recommending just such a system of entirely local, highly decentralized control over the schools. That is the value you have to put against your notion of metropolitan integration.
Bill, do you want to comment?
Professor Horowitz and I, being colleagues, have about the same constitutional argument once a week. It's getting to the point where we do it by numbers now to save time, as the comedians in the Comedians Club did. Everyone heard the same joke, so they signed them numbers, and one comedian would say 7, everyone would laugh. And an outsider came in and said, can I try it? He said, sure, go ahead. He said, 16, dead silence. He said, well, wasn't that a funny story? It's one of the best. He said, what was wrong? He said, you didn't tell it right. And the argument that Hal and I have tends to run along these lines now. It gets quite repetitive. The basic issue between us, I suppose, is whether you read the Constitution as saying there must be equality come hell or high water, or whether you read the Constitution as saying there must be equality only if there are no competing reasons for having inequality. If you read it the latter way, the Constitution doesn't end up meaning very much, I concede, because it's very, very difficult taking a complex school system. If you suggest any kind of reorganization in any direction, there's always some reason for not doing it. There's almost always some reason for not doing something once, the first time. And it means that the constitutional doctrine that I tend toward accepting ends up being very conservative. One advantage, again, of arguing with Professor Horowitz, it puts me in the unusual position of being a conservative. And this is almost as refreshing as working one summer as I did for a Mormon district attorney. So it's nice to have your boss consider you a Gentile.
Let me... I'm sure we've created a very bad impression of lawyers because we have taken more time than we should have. Let me turn to all of you now and see if what we in our wisdom have left uncovered here. Eason, did you want to comment on this other cross-districting problem?
Well, I think not. I'm more interested in the questions
all righty, fine.
than my comments.
Sir.
Well, to just carry up what Bill said, it seems to me one sort of general implication to be drawn both from what Professor Goodman said and perhaps more directly from what Professor Cohn said, is it really looks like there's a sort of paradox about the Constitution. Maybe you can show how it's not. And that is that if people are convinced that something is important, then clearly you don't need the Constitution to bring it about, that it will take place. But if people are not convinced it's important, then the Constitution won't help to bring it about. Therefore, the Constitution doesn't mean anything.
That was Alexander Hamilton's argument in The Federalist, as a matter of fact, for not having a Bill of Rights. I think the argument gets stronger
as you approach those provisions in the Constitution which have the most ambiguity meaning. I think, for example, Alexander Hamilton turns out to be wrong about the First Amendment, which states some values with some particularity in terms of a value, for example, for freedom of expression. The difficulty is, when you start approaching values like equality,